Okay, so we'll talk about the war in Europe. Now we're kind of going to a new discussion, but who was trying to conquer all of Europe at this point? Napoleon, remember, because he sold the Louisiana territory to us for $15 million because he didn't want to have to try to protect it. He needed money for the war. So we're over in Europe and Napoleon's continuing his conquest of Europe. Now, this war is mainly between France and Great Britain. And this is creating some serious problems for the United States. So this war in Europe, mainly between France and Great Britain, is creating some serious problems for the United States. Now, by 1807, Napoleon had conquered most of Europe except for Great Britain. Okay? So by 1807, Napoleon had conquered most of Europe with the exception of Great Britain. Now it was an interesting matchup between the two because the French were much stronger on land with their army, but Great Britain still maintained the strongest navy in the world. So this is an interesting matchup, because the French were stronger on land with their army, but Great Britain still maintained the strongest navy in the world. Now, at first, the United States thought this conflict between Great Britain and France provided us, the US of A, a great opportunity. What would be the great opportunity?
Sell to both.
That's right, sell goods to both sides and make good profits. So the United States looked at the conflict between Great Britain and France as a great opportunity because the United States planned to make good profit on trade with both countries. It sounded like a pretty good deal. Well, how do you think France and Britain feel about that, Brianna? Not good, because France doesn't want us to send anything to Great Britain, and Great Britain doesn't want us to send anything to France, because it simply strengthens countries. So what does the British Navy do that's the strongest navy in the world to prevent us from sending supplies to France?
Attack our ships.
They don't attack, well, they kind of attack them, but
Well, they board them another blockade.
they seize our ships, and what do they do to American sailors? They impress them. They force them to serve in the Royal Navy. So as we're sending goods to France and Great Britain, but as we're sending them to France, the British Navy, the Royal Navy, is seizing these American ships, and they're impressing American sailors. That means they're forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy. They even went as far, they being Great Britain, to pass a series of laws known as the Orders in Council, which is on your ID sheet. So the British even go as far as to pass a series of laws called the Orders in Council. So not only are they seizing our American ships and impressing our American sailors, forcing them to serve in the Royal Navy, they pass a series of laws, Parliament does, called the Orders in Council. Now, you know what this law said? It said that American ships could not enter any foreign ports under the control of France. The Orders in Council say that American ships cannot enter any foreign port under the control of France. So not only can't we enter French ports, we could not trade or enter any ports that were allies of the French. Okay? Very good. How does Austin's question is, how does Great Britain make a law that we have to follow, right? Isn't that what he's saying? And I think Americans thought the same thing, and we'll get to that in a minute.
I'm just thinking, like, how'd that work out for you last time they did that?
Yeah, well, we signed non-importation agreements, right? But they don't care at this point because they don't want us trading anyway, yep.
So, American ships couldn't enter any foreign ports under
Under the control of France. So any port that was an ally of France, we were forbidden to go into according to this law, okay? Now, what do you think France did when they heard about the orders in council? They did, what's that? Well, what did they do?
They
When
did
you
the
get
same
there.
thing back.
They did the same thing back. Yeah, they basically stated, they didn't make a law, but they stated that they would not allow American ships to trade with Britain. So basically, both countries are violating that long-standing principle of foreign relations between countries we call freedom of the seas. That was a long-standing principle between foreign countries, that you could never violate freedom of the seas. It's kind of like, bad comparison in a way, but if Dominic Hartley has land that's on the Gallatin River in Bozeman, can I fish the Gallatin River in Bozeman? As long as I don't step on his land. There's a border about 10 feet, I think it is, or so, that you can, that nobody owns. Dominic doesn't own the river, okay, or the river bottom. So the long-standing principle of fishing is that you can fish in any stream you want as long as you stay in the stream. Freedom of the streams, whatever, okay? Freedom of the seas is that you can't tell people that they can't use the ocean and trade with other countries. Both France and Great Britain are violating this long-standing principle of freedom of the seas. Now, well, Jefferson doesn't want a war at this time with either country. Why? Why?
Because they just stopped funding the
Yeah.
army.
Very good. Congress just passed a law to reduce funding in the Army and the Navy and reduce them both in size. Remember I said that'd come back to bite him. So he certainly doesn't want a war. So what does Jefferson have to do until he can get this thing under control? What's he going to do? What would you do?
Step back.
He takes his ships off the seas. He takes them off the seas until this thing between Great Britain and France cools off or ends. So, not wanting war with either Great Britain or France, President Jefferson takes all American ships off the high seas until the conflict between France and Great Britain ends. Okay, that takes us to our next subtopic, which is the Embargo Act of 1807. Well, how does Jefferson officially take American ships off the high seas? He has to have Congress pass a law to do that. He can't just do it himself. And that law is going to be called the Embargo Act of 1807. So again, President Jefferson wanted to end the continuing American conflict with Great Britain and France, and to ensure this would occur, American ships would have to stay off the high seas. So he urged Congress to pass a law, which was called an embargo. And this law would forbid American ships to trade with any foreign country, including Great Britain and France. So he's basically stopping trade in the United States until this conflict between France and Great Britain gets settled. And this act becomes known as the Embargo Act of 1807. Again, it's a law that not only forbids any trade with Great Britain and France, but it forbids trade with any foreign country. Why would he put any foreign country in there, Rita? Why would he do that?
Just to,
Well, because he can't keep track of who are allies of France and who are allies of Great Britain. So he might go trade with someone not knowing, and what would happen to his ships? Seized, impressed, etc. Yeah, okay? So, now, 3 specific groups of Americans are enraged by this law. There's one. Yep, 3 specific groups of Americans are enraged by this law. And Julie already mentioned one. Merchants, because they can't ship their products. Now their products set in the warehouses. Well, now, hey, Elizabeth Voss, ironically wearing her shirt today. What other group of people are going to be very upset about this? Farmers, because they're selling their goods to merchants who are shipping them overseas. Well, if the merchants aren't selling anything, are they buying from the farmers? No, because they don't want to stockpile their warehouses with stuff they can't sell. What other group of Americans would be upset? Because they would all of a sudden become unemployed.
Sailors.
Sailors, very good, sailors. So the three groups of Americans that were enraged by the Embargo Act of 1807 were merchants who could not ship their products, farmers who could not sell their crops to the merchants, and sailors who all of a sudden became unemployed. How did American shippers, merchants, how'd they get around the law? There's two ways they got around the law. I think you're going to say it. They smuggled, very good. American smuggled goods across the border to Canada. And where did they have their ships? Did they have their ships docked in American ports? Yeah, that's right. So they would smuggle the goods over the Canadian border where they left their ships and took them that way. What might be another way that's kind of similar to the latter part of number one?
Sell it to Canada?
No, they actually would leave their ships either in French ports or British ports, kind of choosing sides. Leave their ships over there, not bring them back. They'd fill them full and get over there and leave them and then kind of go from there until they ran out of goods. Then they would sail back to where? Canada, sneak more stuff over the border and go back and forth. So they were actually leaving their ships out of American ports. Well, this whole thing doesn't work. This Embargo Act doesn't work. So, on March 1st, 1809, President Jefferson asked Congress to repeal the Embargo Act. On March 1st of 1809, mainly because of the pressure he's getting from merchants, farmers, sailors, and citizens in general, President Jefferson asked Congress to repeal the Embargo Act. He asked him to do it on March 1st, 1809. They actually did it just 3 days before he left office as President of the United States. So he asked him to do it on March 1st. They officially did it just 3 days before he left office. So basically, the problem of the war with Great Britain is going to be whose problem? Well, the next President of the United States, who is going to be James Madison. Okay, so Madison's going to have to deal with this. So, finally, under continuous pressure from citizens, merchants, farmers, and sailors, President Jefferson asked Congress to repeal the Embargo Act on March 1st, 1809. They finally repealed the act just 3 days before Jefferson left office as president. And the problem with Great Britain or France is going to be passed on to the next President of the United States, James Madison. In order to get to him, we have to have the election of 1808. Okay, the election of 1808. So obviously Jefferson's not going to run again, is he? Could have, but chose not to. Okay. Well, what's happened every single time almost? Who ends up being the President of the United States? Former President's Secretary of State. Will this be any different? Well, the Republicans are going to nominate Secretary of State James Madison for President. And he had served 8 years as Jefferson's Secretary of State. So the Republicans will go with James Madison. Now this is an interesting election because who is the Vice President at this time? Not Aaron Burr. George Clinton. He decides that he's going to run for president also. But he also is running for vice president with Madison. So he's kind of running for two offices here. Okay? So George Clinton throws his name in for the presidency, but will still be on the Republican ticket for the vice presidency.
So what if he gets president and vice?
Well, he's not, because if he gets elected president, he obviously not going to be vice
So then he
president.
goes on
He's
to
going to
the next
defeat Madison, so yeah, he'll have his own vice president. Now, The Federalists have the same candidates in 1808 as they did in 1804, which were Charles Pinckney for president,
And then
Rufus King for vice president. So the Federalists are going to have the very same candidates in 1808 as they do in 1804. Now, each of the presidential candidates received electoral votes. All three received electoral votes. Clinton got 6 electoral votes. George Clinton. Even though he's running for vice president too, he did get 6 electoral votes as far as the presidency went. George Clinton got 6. Charles C. Pinckney, the Federalist candidate, got 47. And James Madison wins the presidency with 122. So in the Electoral College, George Clinton gets 6 electoral votes. Charles Pinckney gets 47, and James Madison wins the presidency with 122. So even though George Clinton lost his bid for the presidency, he would continue to serve as vice president under Madison. But I want you to think about that. How good of a vice president was he for Madison if he chose to run for president instead? Not very loyal. Obviously he ran for president because he didn't agree with Madison, see? So he's going to undermine Madison most of this presidency. He's not going to be very loyal, okay? But Madison doesn't have much time to worry about the loyalty of his vice president because he's trying to keep himself out of a war with Great Britain, right? Or is he? Okay, yes, Cody?
no.
Okay. All right, that'll take us to President Madison's attempt at diplomacy. You know what diplomacy is? Anybody know what diplomacy is?
Foreign relations or discussion.
Well, if I want to be diplomatic with you,
You like try to talk it out.
yeah, well, my definition is I'm going to allow you to have my way. So some way in diplomacy, when I want you to agree to my way of thinking, I'm going to make it look like it was your idea, right? But actually, you're going to say, you're going to come up with something that is similar to what I want, and I'm just going to encourage you that you're great. And so diplomacy, this is my opinion, diplomacy is allowing others to have your way. Or if you want to be radical, it's telling someone to go to hell and they enjoy the trip. There you go. All right? So it depends on how you want to go. Well, anyway, during his first term as president, Madison was determined that he wanted to regain this freedom of the seas. He did not think it was right that our ships were being harassed, seized, sailors being impressed by both sides during this conflict. And his goal, when he took office, was to regain our freedom of the seas. Now he's going to take the diplomatic route. He's going to send, he's going to urge leaders in both Great Britain and France to remove those restrictions on American shipping. He's going to try to make it their idea that it would be a good idea to get rid of these restrictions. Somehow he may say, well, you know, you're not getting any of our products, you know, gall darn it, we got to come up with something here, let's negotiate, you know, let's be diplomatic about this, let's work together, you know. And that's what he tried to do because he wanted to regain the freedom of the seas for America. Well, finally, he gets halfway there. In August of 1810, Napoleon announces that France would no longer interfere with American shipping. So his diplomatic approach with at least France works. Because in August of 1810, Napoleon announces that France would no longer interfere with American shipping. They would not violate America's freedom of the seas. Unfortunately, Madison didn't get any kind of a response from who? Great Britain. Great Britain. They didn't respond. But France said, hey, okay, we get it. We'll quit interfering. Well, what would you do with Madison? If you were Madison and the French agreed that they wouldn't interfere, but Britain would not, what would you do?
Sell goods to France.
Yeah, absolutely. You'd sell goods like crazy to France. But if he does that, what's he going to end up in? A war with Great Britain. So it's kind of a catch-22. So because Great Britain refused to respond to his diplomatic approach, Madison basically forbid all trade with Great Britain and traded with France, which he knows is going to put him in a path to eventual war with Great Britain. Okay? Well, we got another presidential election of 1812 to talk about now. So what did Madison do his entire first term? Basically, try to regain freedom of the seas with Great Britain and France. Was he successful? Halfway. He got that done with France, but he did not get it done with Great Britain, and now we got another presidential election. As we get closer to this election, we're getting closer to what?
The war.
War with Great Britain. So, as the presidential election of 1812 approaches, the United States is moving closer and closer and closer to a potential war with Great Britain. Now, what group of Americans oppose a war with Great Britain?
Federalists.
Federalists, very good. And their feeling is going to come out in this election. So the Federalist Party, and I can't say only the Federalist Party, there were some other people that didn't want to go to war with Great Britain either, but especially the Federalists are going to show that. Well, the Republicans are going to renominate President Madison, and then they're going to go with Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts as his vice presidential candidate because George Clinton was too disloyal. So Republican leaders nominate President Madison for re-election, and then they choose Elbridge Gerry of Massachusetts to run with him. Well, the Federalists are going to change candidates because Pinckney and King just didn't get it done for them twice in a row, right? So the Federalists are going to nominate DeWitt Clinton for the presidency and Jared Ingersoll for the vice presidency. So the Federalists are going to counter with DeWitt Clinton for the presidency and Jared Ingersoll for the vice presidency. Now this election was much closer than the previous two. This election of 1812 will be much closer than 1808 and much closer than 1804.